Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at the world of venture capital fundraising,
Mm.
but with a bit of a twist. We're going to try to explore whether a rule change meant to really level the playing field actually did. So get ready, folks, to uncover maybe a paradox in the world of startup funding.
Yeah, so this deep dive, it's all about examining the balance between protecting investors and also allowing more people into this exciting market. And it gets even trickier with venture capital.
Yeah.
Venture capital is not really known for transparency.
Right. We've got a stack of research to guide us today, including a report that was actually commissioned by the SEC itself
Yeah.
from NYU professors Sabrina Howell and Dean Parker. They've been looking into the impact of a 2013 update to Regulation D, which governs how VC funds raise money. But before we get into that, can you give us a little background on the regulations themselves?
Sure. So Regulation D, it offers exemptions from the usual very strict securities registration process. So before 2013, most funds used what's called 506B, essentially relying on their existing network of investors. You can think of it like a close-knit club.
Got it. So you're raising money from people you already know and have a relationship with. But then in 2013, 506C came along.
Yeah.
And that changed the game, right?
Yeah, it was supposed to. So 506C allows for general solicitation, meaning VCs can now publicly advertise their fund. So imagine like announcements on websites, social media, even reaching out to people they've never met before. It sounds pretty revolutionary, doesn't it?
It does. You'd think everyone would be jumping on board, more potential investors, maybe even a chance to diversify the investor pool. But that's not exactly what happened, is it?
Not at all. Howell and Parker found that over a 10-year period, only about 8.4% of funds used 506C. And get this, the ones that did use it, they actually saw better returns, outperforming 506B funds by an average of 1.8%.
Wait, so they performed better,
Mhm.
but were less popular? That's counterintuitive. What's going on here? This feels like a real mystery.
Yeah, that's the puzzle that Howell and Parker set out to solve. So they started by looking at the types of funds that were using 506C.
Okay, let's unpack that. Who were these trailblazers? Were they the big established funds, or were they doing something different?
Actually, they were often the opposite. They tended to be smaller funds, uh, based outside of the usual VC hotspots, like
Hmm.
Silicon Valley. And more interestingly, they were more likely to have female, Black, or Hispanic managers.
So the people who could benefit the most from reaching a wider pool of investors were the ones actually doing it. That makes sense on some level, but it still doesn't explain why 506C wasn't more widely adopted, especially given the performance data. There's got to be more to the story, right?
Yeah, it's almost like there's this hidden barrier, something that's preventing more funds from using 506C, even though, it could lead to better returns. And this is where the research gets really interesting. So Howell and Parker, they came up with a name for this phenomenon, the track record paradox.
Ooh, a paradox. That sounds juicy. Can you explain what they mean by that?
Yeah. So think of it this way. It's like needing a good credit score to get a loan, but then needing a loan to actually build up your credit score in the first place. So to raise money from strangers, which 506C allows. You need a track record of success, but how do you build that track record?
By relying on those strong personal networks that 506B depends on. I'm starting to see where this is going, but
Yeah.
that creates a real problem, especially for underrepresented groups who often lack access to those traditional networks in the first place.
Exactly. It's a classic catch-22. You need the track record to get the funding, but you need the funding to build the track record. And for those who are already on the outside looking in, it becomes even harder to break through.
This paradox,
Mm.
it kind of paints a pretty bleak picture, and it really highlights the limitations of simply changing the rules.
Hmm.
It's like you can open the door, but if there's a giant wall right behind it, it doesn't really help much.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. It's not enough to just create the opportunity. You have to address the underlying structural barriers
Yeah.
that prevent people from actually taking advantage of that opportunity. And that's precisely what Howell and Parker's research starts to unpack.
And what do they find? Were there any clues in the data that might help explain why this paradox exists?
Absolutely. Let's dive into the research and see what they uncovered. So, one of their key findings was that 506C funds, they were far more sensitive to having a strong track record compared to 506B funds. So without those past wins, seems like fundraising at arm's length is a real uphill battle.
So those pre-existing relationships, they really do smooth things over in a way that simply opening up to more investors just doesn't.
I'm guessing this difference was even more pronounced for underrepresented managers, right?
You guessed it. Yeah, the data showed that underrepresented managers who did use 506C, they tended to have much stronger track records than their counterparts using 506B, almost like they needed to overcompensate
Yeah.
for the lack of those traditional connections.
So it's not just about opening the door, it's about what you need to even get your foot in that door in the first place. This track record paradox, it's starting to feel like a real catch-22. It is. And there's another layer to this, a rule from way back in 1940, the Investment Company Act. It actually limited the number of investors that a venture fund could have.
Wow, a blast from the past. How does a rule from 1940 affect things today?
Well, this limitation could particularly impact those relying on 506C and its broader reach. Because if you're building your network from scratch, you might need to gather smaller investments.
From a larger number of people, right?
Right, that makes sense. You're casting a wider net, so you're likely to catch smaller fish, so to speak. So how many investors could they have?
So the original cap was 100 investors, but here's where things get interesting. 2018, that cap was raised to 250 investors for smaller funds.
Okay, so more investors allowed, potentially making 506C more appealing. So what impact did this have?
Well, the research showed that after this change, 506C adoption actually increased, and
Yeah.
particularly among, you guessed it, underrepresented managers. So even small tweaks to these regulations can have a real ripple effect, especially for those who are most affected by these systemic barriers. It's like they were finally given a tool that could help them overcome the track record paradox.
Exactly. But even with this change, 506C adoption, it remains relatively low, so it makes you wonder, like, what other factors might be at play?
You're right. There has to be more to it than just these regulatory hurdles. What other insights did Howell and Parker uncover?
Well, they also looked into the process of verifying accredited investors, something that's required under 506C. And while the steps themselves might not seem too burdensome, they can create friction.
Fiction, meaning it's more of a hassle than it needs to be.
Yeah, think paperwork, time, potential legal issues if it's not done correctly. And Howell and Parker surveys revealed that both fund managers and their lawyers, they felt this process was tedious and potentially risky.
That makes sense. No one wants to deal with extra paperwork or legal headaches. But is that really enough to deter someone from using 506C?
Well, it's a factor, but they also highlighted the issue of signaling.
Signaling, like venture capitalists setting smoke signals to attract investors.
Not quite. It's about the subtle messages that we send, even unintentionally. So using 506C might inadvertently signal to investors that a fund manager is desperate or that they lack the necessary connections.
So it's kind of like showing up to a black tie gala in a T-shirt and jeans.
Yeah.
You might be perfectly qualified to be there, but people might question whether you belong.
Exactly. It's about perception. If all the established players are doing things one way, deviating from the norm can really raise eyebrows.
That's fascinating. So even if 506C makes sense on paper, there are these unspoken rules and social dynamics that can make it a less desirable option. It's like this invisible hurdle that's hard to quantify, but has a very real impact.
Precisely. And it's something that regulation alone might not be able to fully address.
So where does that leave us? Did 506C revolutionize venture capital and open the doors for everyone?
Well, it's complicated. While it did lead to some positive shifts, the track record paradox and those subtle synching effects, they really show the challenges of trying to level the playing field through regulations alone.
So it's more about giving people the tools and the support they need to actually navigate this complex landscape and overcome these invisible hurdles.
You got it.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive. We've learned a lot about the challenges and complexities of trying to create a more inclusive venture capital ecosystem. But before we wrap up, I'm curious to hear your final thoughts. What are some of the key takeaways from this research?
One of the biggest takeaways is that access to capital. It isn't a simple equation. Regulation plays a role, but it's intertwined with social networks, historical patterns, and even investor psychology.
We've also seen how seemingly small rule changes can have unintended consequences, and it sounds like tackling these issues requires a much more nuanced approach.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Simply changing regulations without addressing the underlying social and structural barriers might not be enough.
So what can be done to overcome this track record paradox
Yeah.
and create a system where access to capital isn't so heavily determined by who you know or what you've already achieved?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The research suggests that relying on regulation alone, it might not be enough. We need to think about ways to address those underlying structural
Or
barriers.
like what? Give us some examples.
Well, one idea is to, create more opportunities for underrepresented managers to build those track records without, being limited by a traditional network.
So giving them a chance to prove themselves without needing those pre-existing connections.
Exactly. Think mentorship programs
Mm.
or targeted investment initiatives, or even incubator-like structures designed to help them, get those early wins.
Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
like building a bridge to help them cross that chasm between potential and proven success.
That's a great way to put it. And we can also explore, making the verification process for accredited investors less burdensome, maybe streamlining procedures, or even shifting some of the burden to the investors themselves.
That makes sense. Reduce the friction, make it easier for everyone involved. But what about that signaling issue? Any ideas on how to tackle something so deeply ingrained in the culture?
That's a tough one, but perhaps promoting greater transparency around fundraising could help. So imagine like a database of 506c funds and their performance, highlighting success stories.
So instead of seeing 506c as a sign of desperation, it becomes a badge of honor, a
Yeah.
signal of innovation, and a commitment to inclusivity.
Exactly. We need to shift the narrative and maybe even
Fix it, man.
create some positive signaling around it. So imagine like seeking investment from a wider pool, being seen as a strength, not a weakness.
Yeah, that'd be a real game changer.
It would. It would take effort from everyone involved: policymakers, investors, fund managers, and even those of us studying this space. But I do believe it's possible to create a system that's both more accessible and more effective at funding the innovations that will shape our future.
That's an inspiring thought to end on. So, did the introduction of general solicitation revolutionize venture capital and open the doors for everyone? Well, the data suggests it's more complicated than that.
It did create some positive shifts, but the track record paradox and those subtle signaling effects, they show the challenges of trying to level the playing field through regulations alone.
It seems like creating a truly inclusive venture capital landscape, it requires a more holistic approach, one that addresses the deeper social and structural barriers that persist.
Yeah. What this deep dive reveals is that access to capital, it's rarely simple. Regulations, they're just one piece of the puzzle. We need to consider how they interact with social networks, historical patterns, and even investor psychology.
And to our listeners,
Yeah.
what do you think? Is there a way to overcome this paradox
Yeah.
and create a more inclusive venture capital landscape? What innovative solutions could help bridge the gap between those with groundbreaking ideas
Mm.
and those with the capital to make them a reality? Let us know your thoughts. We'll see you in the next deep dive.